Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When I first set eyes on the wild hills above Whispering Pines, I saw a dream waiting to be built. I created a sanctuary, only to face a silent war from those I once protected. They didn't know it yet, but they had just picked a fight with the wrong man. When I first laid eyes on the hillside overlooking Whispering Pines, I knew I had found something special. It wasn't just the breathtaking view of the lake stretching out like a silver ribbon below, or the way the pine trees whispered with every breeze. It was the feeling of potential, a place that could become a sanctuary for hundreds of families, if built right. And that's exactly what I did. Through my company, Brooks Development, we shaped that raw beauty into the most sought-after community in the state. Parks, tree-lined streets, a world-class community center with a gleaming pool, all funded quietly by me. I didn't want my name plastered on signs or etched into plaques. Let the families enjoy it without knowing who made it possible. I preferred my privacy. I always did. Once the heavy lifting was done and the last brick laid, I stepped back. Whispering Pines thrived, and I turned my attention elsewhere. But I never truly let it go. A few months ago, I decided to build a small cottage, something modest just for myself and my family, on a private plot of land perched above the community. I made sure the legal lines were clear. My land was separate, unaffiliated with any HOA. I wasn't interested in lawn inspections, mailbox color approvals, or neighborhood bake sales. I just wanted a place to retreat, grill a steak with my boys, watch the sunset with my wife, and swim in the very pool I had paid to build, though I never once flashed that fact to anyone. The cottage came together beautifully. A blend of rustic stone and warm cedar, it stood tucked among towering pines, invisible from the main road, but commanding an unparalleled view. It was my secret place, a reward for years of grinding work. No staff, no security detail. Just me, my family, and the silence. Every few weeks, we'd escape there. Slow weekends full of smoky barbecues, laughter around the fire pit, lazy afternoons by the lake. No one bothered us. The townfolk knew better than to ask questions about the quiet man on the hill. Life was good, peaceful, simple. At least it was, until the first letter arrived. It started innocently enough. A simple white envelope tucked neatly into my mailbox, bearing the seal of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I remember holding it in my hand, a bemused smile creeping onto my face. Surely it was some mistake. I wasn't part of their little kingdom of rules and regulations. My land had been legally set apart from the beginning. Curious, I tore it open as I walked back toward the cottage. Inside was a formal invitation to join the HOA. It was written in syrupy language, thanking me for choosing to reside near our wonderful community and strongly encouraging me to officially enroll as a member to ensure harmony and mutual respect among neighbors. I chuckled to myself, crumpled it without a second thought, and tossed it into the kitchen trash. No sense wasting time on nonsense. Weeks passed, autumn gave way to winter, and life remained undisturbed. But when I returned after a 2-week business trip, the mailbox was stuffed again. This time, there were 3 envelopes, each thicker than the last. The first was a follow-up, a polite reminder that they were awaiting my enrollment. The second was more insistent, outlining the benefits of joining, access to facilities I had literally paid to create, as if dangling a treat before a dog. The third, that one was different. The language shifted from neighborly to thinly veiled threat. It stated that although my property was technically adjacent, my proximity placed me within the spirit of the HOA jurisdiction. They warned that failure to comply could result in unwanted legal entanglements due to conflicting land use standards. Reading between the lines was easy. Join us, or we'll find a way to make your life miserable. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of anger, not because they dared threaten me. No, it was the arrogance. The sheer audacity of people who didn't know the first thing about who they were dealing with, trying to bully me with petty intimidation tactics. Still, I chose to stay silent. I tossed the letters into a desk drawer and returned to my weekend plans. Better to observe, to see how far they would take their foolishness. That evening, as I grilled steaks with my sons under the fading orange sky, I noticed something buzzing above the treetops. A small drone hovered in the air, bobbing against the wind, its camera unmistakably angled toward my property. I set down my tongs, wiping my hands on a towel, and stared at it. Whoever was behind that drone wasn't even trying to be subtle. I had barely registered the drone's presence when headlights flickered through the trees, and a black SUV pulled up just outside my private gate. I watched, arms folded, as a woman climbed out. All sharp angles, high heels sinking into the soft earth, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She marched up to the gate, rapped on it sharply, and called out, "Good evening. I'm Karen Baker, president of the Whispering Pines HOA." I didn't move right away. I studied her. The perfect suburban storm. Stiff blazer, tight-lipped smile, and the unmistakable aura of someone who thought they could bend the world to their will by the sheer force of self-importance. Finally, I walked down to meet her, taking my time, giving her a long look through the bars of the gate. "Evening," I said mildly. Karen's smile strained. "We noticed your property is quite close to the community border. We believe it's in everyone's best interest for you to enroll in the HOA. It's mandatory for harmony." I gave a small laugh, not unkindly. "I'm not part of your HOA. Never have been. Never will be." Her smile slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by something colder, hungrier. "You really ought to reconsider," she said, voice lowering. "It would be a shame if misunderstandings created problems for everyone." I leaned my elbow casually on the gate. "Appreciate the concern, but I like my problems the way they are. Simple." Karen's face hardened. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stomped back to her car, the wheels of her SUV spitting gravel as she tore off down the road. I watched her taillights disappear into the twilight, the drone still buzzing faintly overhead. And for the first time, I realized this was no longer just a nuisance. This was a declaration of war. The next time Karen came, it wasn't with a polite letter or a veiled threat. It was personal. I was sitting on the porch, nursing a cup of black coffee and enjoying the early morning calm when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Her black SUV pulled up again, this time closer, practically pressing against my property line. The doors swung open like a coordinated assault, and out she stepped, clipboard in hand, flanked by two men in matching polo shirts and smug expressions. They looked like overgrown hall monitors, fresh off a training seminar on how to intimidate people with rules they didn't understand. I stood up slowly, setting my coffee down, feeling a coil of cold amusement wind through me. "This ought to be interesting." Karen approached the gate with the two men trailing behind her. She didn't bother smiling this time. She flipped open her clipboard with a theatrical flourish, pulling out a stack of papers. "Mr. Brooks," she began, her voice clipped and brittle. "This is your final opportunity to accept membership in the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Given the proximity of your property, refusal to comply will constitute a violation under our expanded boundary ordinances." I raised an eyebrow. "Expanded boundaries? That sounds fascinating. Got a judge's signature on that? Or is it just something you scribbled on a napkin?" One of the polo-shirted men bristled, taking a step forward, but Karen shot him a warning glance. She cleared her throat and pressed on. "Failure to enroll will leave us no choice but to initiate civil proceedings. This community cannot tolerate renegade properties bringing down our standards." I leaned against the gatepost, studying her. "Renegade properties. That's rich. Remind me, Karen, who paid for your community center, your parks, your shiny little clubhouse down by the lake?" For a split second, confusion flickered across her face. She didn't know. Of course she didn't. Karen recovered quickly, her voice rising. "Regardless of any past contributions, you are subject to current regulations. This is your final notice. We will not ask again." The two men stepped closer, attempting to loom over the fence as if proximity could change reality. I stayed relaxed, arms folded across my chest. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "this whole thing could have been avoided if you'd done a little research, but I guess that's not your style." Karen's eyes flashed with fury. She slapped the clipboard against her thigh and leaned in, voice dropping to a hiss. "You'll regret crossing me. People like you always do." I smiled lazily. "People like me? You have no idea what kind of person I am." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked back toward the cottage, feeling her glare burning holes into my back. I didn't rush. I didn't slam the door. I simply left her there, fuming outside the gate she couldn't cross. As I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, I thought about the way Karen had spoken. So sure of her power, so certain that paperwork and intimidation would bend me to her will. It would be her first mistake, but it wouldn't be her last. After that morning, I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen made her next move. I wasn't the kind of man to sit around waiting to be blindsided. No, If this was going to turn into a war, I needed to know the battlefield. I called Michael, my personal attorney, a man with a sharp mind and a taste for uncovering ugly truths. He wasn't just a lawyer, he had a background in private investigations, a skill set I suspected would be very useful now. Michael didn't disappoint. Within a week, he had dug deep into the heart of Whispering Pines HOA. What he found was even worse than I anticipated. Karen hadn't just bullied her way into the presidency. She had orchestrated a quiet coup. Over the past 6 months, she'd systematically forced out nearly every member of the previous board, replacing them with her own hand-picked cronies. Anyone who opposed her found themselves fined, harassed, or quietly ostracized until they either bent the knee or moved out. Under her leadership, new bylaws were rushed through without proper community votes. Steep penalties were levied for the most trivial offenses. A faded welcome mat, a flower bed one shade too bright, children's bikes left temporarily on porches. It wasn't about standards anymore. It was about control. Karen's control. Meanwhile, dues had skyrocketed. Michael uncovered financial records that showed absurd expenditures billed to the HOA's operating budget, luxury retreats for board training, catered emergency meetings, and even private security patrols supposedly hired for community safety. The neighborhood wasn't being protected, it was being bled dry. I wasn't content just hearing secondhand reports. I went down myself, blending in during the afternoon hours when residents walked their dogs or worked in their gardens. Casual conversations, nods, a few words here and there. It didn't take long before stories started pouring out. A young couple fined into near bankruptcy for repainting their door. An elderly widow forced to sell after constant harassment over the length of her grass. Parents afraid to let their kids play outside for fear of violations. The worst part was the hopelessness in their voices. They felt trapped, isolated, powerless against a board that acted more like a private militia than a governing body. I returned to the cottage with a stack of recorded conversations, printed bylaws, and financial statements Michael had collected. My dining table transformed into a war room covered in papers, diagrams, and timelines. It was no longer about a few letters or a power-hungry woman trying to puff herself up. Karen had built a small, corrupt empire, and now she thought she could expand it. To me, to my land. She had no idea that she'd just declared war against the man who built her kingdom from the ground up. It was a cool, cloudless afternoon when they made their move. I was inside the cottage, sorting through the latest pile of evidence we had collected, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Through the front window, I saw them. A black and white police cruiser, lights flashing lazily, pulling up right behind Karen's now familiar SUV. For a moment, I simply stood there, watching. It felt off immediately. The cruiser was too clean, almost like a movie prop, and the officer who stepped out moved with the stiff, exaggerated authority of someone playing a role rather than living it. Karen followed behind him, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face like a trophy. I opened the front door, but stayed on the porch, arms crossed, making them come to me. The man in uniform, mid-40s, buzz-cut, mirrored sunglasses, marched up the steps with Karen hovering at his side. He pulled out a folded map, which he brandished like a weapon. "Sir," he barked in a voice that tried too hard to sound official, "you're occupying land that now falls within the jurisdiction of Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Under municipal code sections recently updated in cooperation with HOA governance, you are required to comply." Karen chimed in, voice sugary sweet and venomous. "Of course, we don't want this to escalate unnecessarily. All we ask is that you sign the membership forms. Once you're part of our community officially, there won't be any complications." I kept my expression blank, though inside I marveled at their nerve. Forged maps. A fake cop. Manufactured ordinances that didn't exist. They were in so deep, they couldn't even see how ridiculous it had become. The officer leaned closer. "Refusal to cooperate may result in immediate legal action, including fines and potential criminal charges. We can escalate this to an arrest today, sir, if you insist on being difficult." He rested his hand near the cuffs at his belt in a move meant to intimidate. Karen, meanwhile, clutched a clipboard with all the faux legal membership documents. I feigned hesitation. My heart didn't race. It never did in moments like this. But I tilted my head, playing the part of the confused, slightly frightened landowner. I didn't realize it was that serious," I said, letting just the right amount of tremor enter my voice. Karen's grin widened like a shark scenting blood. It's very serious, Mr. Brooks, but we're reasonable people. Signed today, and no harm done. Behind the door, unseen, Michael was recording everything. He had already called the real police the moment the fake cruiser rolled up. I just needed to stall. I stepped back, opening the door slightly, pretending to deliberate. Can I just read the papers first? Karen shook her head firmly. Standard procedure. Just sign. Trust us. The officer took a step forward, hand now fully resting on his fake sidearm. Sign it, sir, or we're taking you in for trespassing on regulated property. Trespassing on my own land. I almost laughed out loud. I took the clipboard from Karen with exaggerated slowness, flipping through the papers filled with legal gibberish and official-looking seals. I scratched my chin, giving the illusion of wavering, dragging it out. Minutes ticked by. The tension in the air grew thick, Karen's impatience palpable. The fake cop was practically vibrating with the need to act, to seize control. And then, like the answering clap of a storm, the real siren sounded in the distance. Karen's head snapped toward the sound, her confidence visibly faltering. The officer shifted nervously, his hand dropping from the cuffs. Within moments, 2 marked sheriff's department vehicles tore up my driveway, dust spraying in their wake. Real deputies spilled out, weapons drawn but controlled, moving with the crisp precision of actual law enforcement. The fake cop froze, then slowly raised his hands. Karen turned to run, but it was too late. One of the deputies intercepted her easily, clamping a hand on her arm and reading her rights. I stood there on the porch, watching it all unfold with the same calm detachment I might reserve for a passing thunderstorm. Michael emerged from inside, holding up the recorder and nodding once to the deputies. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The fake officer was shoved into the back of a cruiser, his badge confiscated, the fake cruiser's plates exposed as nothing but vanity props. Karen was cuffed and placed gently, almost mockingly, into the second vehicle, her face a mask of disbelief. I caught her eye as they closed the door. There was no triumph in my expression, just cold inevitability. She had played a game she didn't understand, and now the house she had built with lies and intimidation was coming down on her head. And it was only the beginning. The days that followed their arrests were a flurry of controlled chaos, and I was at the center of it, pulling the strings in a way Karen would have never imagined. Once the sheriffs carted her and her fake officer away, the real investigation kicked into high gear. Deputies and county officials swarmed the Whispering Pines HOA office like hornets tearing into a rotten hive. I kept my distance, letting Michael handle most of the direct interactions with law enforcement. We had handed over everything: the recorded threats, the fake documents, the drone footage, the letters. Every piece painted a clear and devastating picture of a group of people who believed they were untouchable. Within 48 hours, it wasn't just Karen and her fake cop sitting behind bars. Several other board members were arrested on charges ranging from conspiracy to defraud, misappropriation of community funds, falsification of public documents, and harassment. It turned out Karen's thirst for power was contagious and deeply infectious within the board she had stacked. The news broke fast. Local headlines screamed about the HOA corruption scandal. Photos of Karen, scowling and disheveled in an orange jumpsuit, plastered every news site and TV station for miles around. Residents of Whispering Pines, many of whom had once tiptoed under the weight of her rules, now stood outside their homes in small groups, openly discussing her downfall. The fear that had once gripped them evaporated almost overnight. Michael kept me updated on the finer details as the case unfolded. The county prosecutor was salivating at the chance to make an example out of Karen and her crew. More victims stepped forward every day, emboldened by the sudden shift in power. Families who had been fined into hardship. Seniors who had been harassed into selling their homes. Even children bullied for having a lemonade stand without proper authorization. They all came forward, their voices finally heard. I didn't parade myself through town or accept interviews, even though the offers came thick and fast once whispers began to circulate about who I really was. That wasn't my way. My satisfaction came from knowing that justice, real, unavoidable justice, was coming down hard and fast. One evening, as I stood on my porch watching the sun dip low behind the pines, Michael called with the final piece of news. Formal charges filed, court date set. Karen's lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea, but the DA isn't biting. Too much heat, Too much public interest. She's going down hard. I simply nodded, feeling the heavy, solid weight of inevitability settle across my shoulders. It was never about revenge, not for me. It was about restoring the balance that Karen had so greedily upset. It was about reminding people like her, that there are still lines you cannot cross, no matter how much you believe the world belongs to you. And Karen had crossed every last one. The trial didn't take long. With the mountain of evidence we had provided and the growing number of residents willing to testify against Karen and her cronies, it was more of a public dismantling than a legal proceeding. Every dirty trick they had pulled, every life they had upended, was laid bare in that courtroom under the unflinching eye of the law. I sat quietly in the gallery, an unremarkable figure among the gathered crowd, watching Karen's world crumble piece by piece. She avoided looking at anyone, her once impenetrable armor of arrogance reduced to a tattered shell. Her lawyers' attempts to frame her as a well-meaning leader gone astray fell flat. The evidence spoke louder than any carefully rehearsed excuses. When the guilty verdict was finally read, a ripple of relief ran through the courtroom. Karen was sentenced to several years in prison, with heavy fines and restitution owed to the victims she had extorted and bullied. The other board members received their own share of justice, probation, community service, and financial penalties that would follow them for years. Still, even as the courtroom emptied and the journalists descended on the steps outside, I kept my distance. The real work wasn't about gloating over Karen's fall. It was about building something better in the ashes she had left behind. A week after the verdict, the Whispering Pines community organized a meeting, a real one this time, free from threats and intimidation. The interim board, made up of longtime residents who genuinely cared about the neighborhood, asked me to attend. They said they wanted to thank me personally. At first I hesitated, but then I realized it was time to step out of the shadows, just this once. The evening of the meeting, I stood before the crowd gathered in the newly reopened community center, the very same building I had paid for years ago. Faces turned toward me, expectant, some recognizing me from distant interactions, others realizing for the first time who had truly shaped their community. I cleared my throat, feeling the weight of the moment. "My name is Nicholas Brooks," I said simply. A quiet murmur ran through the crowd. "Some of you know me as the man who lives up on the hill. What you may not know is that I funded the creation of Whispering Pines. The parks, the clubhouse, the amenities you enjoy, they were my gift to this community, and I never wanted anything in return." I paused, letting it sink in. I built this place to be a haven, not a prison. I never intended for anyone to use it as a weapon against their neighbors. I'm grateful that now, finally, it can be the kind of community it was meant to be. For a moment, there was silence. Then the applause came, hesitant at first, then rising into a standing ovation that filled the hall. I smiled, a real smile this time. Not the guarded kind I usually wore, but something genuine. The war was over. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Life after the trial settled into a quiet rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. The fear that had once clung to the streets of Whispering Pines had vanished. Families who had once kept their heads down now waved at each other from across the street. Children played freely in the parks without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Front porches, once barren and silent, now bloomed with flowers, laughter, and the soft glow of community life returning. I stayed in my cottage, just as I always had, but everything felt different. It wasn't isolation anymore. It was peaceful observation. From my hilltop, I could see the heartbeat of the neighborhood thrum stronger with every passing day. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. The new HOA leadership, under careful watch, reinstated a fair and transparent system. Gone were the arbitrary fines, the harassment, the sense of living under a tyrant's thumb. Instead, they focused on building events, community projects, and genuinely listening to the voices that made up Whispering Pines. It was what it should have been from the beginning, a home, not a battlefield. Sometimes I would sit out on the porch at sunset, a glass of whiskey in hand, and watch the way the light caught the rooftops and treetops, bathing the whole valley in gold. Those were the moments that made everything. The months of tension, the courtroom battles, the patience it had taken to let Karen hang herself with her own rope, worthwhile. Michael came by once in a while, usually bringing news from town or some fresh bit of gossip he thought I'd find amusing. We'd sit and talk about everything and nothing. Two men who had seen too much to ever take peace for granted again. One evening, as we watched the sunset bleed into the horizon, Michael turned to me with a half smile. "You ever think about telling everyone who you really are?" I shook my head, letting the silence answer for me. It was enough to know. It was enough to see the community thrive without needing to plant a flag in the middle of it. The real reward wasn't fame or gratitude. It was seeing the place I'd built finally live up to its potential, free from fear. Karen was gone. Her name little more than a cautionary whisper among the residents now. No one missed her. No one mentioned her. It was as if the town itself had exhaled and moved on, leaving her and her petty empire buried under the weight of their own making. I stayed on that porch long after Michael left that night, the sky fading from deep orange to indigo. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine and distant campfires. And as darkness settled over Whispering Pines, I realized something simple, something true. Sometimes the greatest victories are the quietest ones, the ones that need no parade, no speeches, no recognition. Just a good piece of land, a peaceful heart, and the knowledge that you stood your ground when it mattered most. And that was enough for me.